In acquiring sonar equipment, the Navy didn't quite go deep enough into the fine points of small business rules. In a small business set-aside, the question of whether an offer could be a non-manufacturer showed just how complicated things can get. We get details now from Haynes Boone procurement attorney Zach Prince. And Zach, sounds like they got their anchor chain twisted up on this one, which should have been a pretty simple procurement.
Yeah, they did, Tom.
Well, tell us more about it.
Sure. So this is a procurement conducted by the Naval Undersea Warfare Center. They were buying sonar sounding sets, which are a tool for measuring the depth of water beneath the lowest projection on a vessel. So the Navy set this procurement aside for small businesses after they did market research. The famous rule of two provides that if there's a reasonable expectation that an agency is going to receive offers from at least two responsible small businesses, and award would be at a fair market price, then the agency has to set aside the procurement for small businesses, which is what happened here. The problem is that there's a rule called the non-manufacturer rule. That rule is that if you're a small business that's going to be selling a product to the government, either you have to have manufactured that product, or if you're selling somebody else's manufactured product, that manufacturer has to be a domestic small business. There are a few other qualifications there too. But the Navy, when they did their research here, they thought, non-manufacturer rule doesn't apply because there's a class deviation that the Small Business Administration had issued for this NAICS code. At least that's how they originally read it. So they solicited proposals from two offerers on that basis.
Right, and one of those offers was a non-manufacturer, which the Navy thought would be okay because of the deviation for the code of equipment, the class that included sonar.
Yeah, that's right. So Knudsen Systems, or KSI, was one of the offers here. There were only two, and they complied with the RFP. The RFP was very clear that non-manufacturer rule does not apply here. It didn't have the FAR provision for non-manufacturer. It said that a class waiver applies. So KSI thought it was compliant and submitted a proposal.
All right, what happened then?
Well, lo and behold, after they submitted their proposal and the Navy evaluated it, the Navy realized, wait a minute, they read the waiver wrong. And the waiver actually only applies to one very specific type of equipment that's for aviation, not for everything under this NAICS code. And so they informed KSI, sorry, you're disqualified because you're providing a good manufactured in Canada.
Right. So KSI said, well, sorry, see you later, or did they protest?
They quickly protested the GAO. And GAO, I think, would have sustained that protest too, but the Navy said, don't worry, we're going to go take corrective action. We're going to amend the RFP so it says clearly what's required here, that is the non-manufacturer rule applies. We'll have discussions with the offerers and we'll allow revisions to proposals. Well, of course, that's not going to help KSI. Right, because they've still got a good that's coming from Canada. They don't manufacture this. So instead of submitting a new revised proposal, they protested again. And that's where we landed here.
Right. And before we get to that second protest, if they had been a reseller of a piece of equipment made by a small business in the United States, they would have been okay.
Yeah, that's right. Unfortunately, they weren't.
All right. We're speaking with Zach Prince. He's a procurement attorney and partner at Haynes Boone. So they protested again over the amendment that the Navy did trying to fix things.
Yeah, that's right. So they argued that this amendment was intrinsically flawed because the Navy's analysis, that is their market research that led them to set aside this procurement, was based on a incorrect assumption that the non-manufacturer rule was not applicable. So when they went out and did research and decided, there are at least, I think they said 5 potential offerers here, they were thinking offerers were providing a good of somebody, and it didn't matter who's good. Right. But in reality, what mattered was that there would be at least 2 offerers who are supplying a good either manufactured by that small business in the U.S. or from another small business in the U.S. And they never did that type of analysis. So the argument was that they never should have set this aside, or at least they should be required to go back and do new market research before deciding to set aside this procurement.
Right. So it sounds like Knudsen Systems, Inc., KSI, was going to be out of this contract no matter what the Navy did, though.
Yeah, that's right, unless the Navy opens it up to full and open competition.
In which case, then a small business could offer something from a large business, and presumably Canada's okay for, putting on a Navy ship. It's not from China or something.
Yeah, I think that's right. So they didn't go into any analysis about Buy American or Trade Agreements Act, but I think likely it would have been fine. The Navy is already buying stuff from KSI. In fact, it seems like they're buying essentially the same thing that KSI was offering here under a prior procurement. Whether that was full and open or it was because the Navy misunderstood the application of the non-manufacture rule, that's not totally clear from the protest. But KSI, if it were full and open, would have presumably been fine.
Yeah, interesting. KSI knew this. Seems like they might have raised it earlier in the procurement, but be that as it may, what did GAO say on the second protest?
GAO agreed with KSI. GAO generally is not going to overturn an agency decision to set aside procurements for small businesses unless it's clearly unreasonable. And here it was clearly unreasonable because they had no market research. Their market research was just considering the wrong set of facts. There probably are at least a few offerers out there who could sell, that are small businesses and could sell the product the Navy needs. The problem was only one of them apparently manufactures it themselves in the U.S.
Right. I guess I don't know whether these pieces of equipment are $10 million things, $1 million things, or do people buy them for $10,000 and put them on yachts? We don't know that from the presentation of these facts, do we?
No, the contract here would have been about $2.5 million. So presumably that's buying a couple pieces of equipment. And they're not necessarily terribly expensive, but there just isn't apparently that level of domestic industry, at least with small businesses.
Right. So now what should the Navy do then?
They should go back out and issue a new RFI and see what kind of responses they get. Initially, they issued an RFI for their market research, and they got responses from the eventual offerors here. But that was predicated on the belief that it didn't have to be a domestic item manufactured by a small business in the U.S. Now they should be specific. Are there small businesses that are going to be providing something compliant with the non-manufacturer rule? And if only one, that is the actual awardee here, responds and says, yeah, then this should be full and open, and they should go out and reprocure it.
Right. So for a company like KSI that is small woman-owned business but is representing a non-U.S. manufacturer that might in fact be large, we don't know who it is, from Canada, then the only way they could get certain contracts is through full and open, even though they are a small woman-owned business.
Yeah, that's right. The other option for the Navy here, agencies could always ignore GAO. Then they have to explain to Congress why they did that, which is why it almost never happens. Or they could say, we just have an urgent, compelling need for this, and they'll issue a justification and approval and proceed that way, essentially as a sole source. But I didn't get the sense from reading this decision that the Navy argued that they just need this so badly, so quickly, that they have to go that route.
Yeah, well, in the meantime, keep your ships in deep water that are waiting for these new sonar machines, maybe.
Maybe.
Procurement attorney Zach Prince is a partner at Haynes Moon. As always, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
And we'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.